The call came at 3 a.m., jolting me awake with that sickening certainty that only bad news arrives at this hour. My brother Ethan's voice crackled through the speaker, uncharacteristically hesitant. "Riley, it's Harold. He's gone. My name is Riley, and this is how my quiet life turned into a battlefield I never wanted to fight in." I sat up in bed, my mind racing to process the information. Harold Lawson, my elderly neighbor, Edith's husband of 52 years. And the closest thing I had to a grandfather since moving to the city was dead. Just like that. What happened? I managed to ask, already throwing on clothes with my free hand. Heart attack, they think. Edith found him in his workshop. Ethan paused, and I could hear muffled voices in the background. "Listen, Vanessa and I are heading over there now. You should come too." Of course Vanessa would be there. My sister-in-law never missed an opportunity to insert herself into family matters, especially ones involving property or money. I pushed the thought aside, feeling guilty for thinking ill of her at a time like this. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said, hanging up before he could respond. The drive to Edith's house was surreal. Streetlights cast orange shadows across my dashboard as I navigated the empty streets, my mind replaying yesterday's conversation with Harold. He'd been showing me his latest woodworking project, a delicate music box he was making for Edith's birthday. "Life's too short not to make beautiful things," he'd said, his weathered hands carefully sanding the maple lid. When I pulled up to their Victorian home, several cars were already parked outside. Ethan's black SUV sat in the driveway, and I recognized Mark Reynolds' beat-up Honda among them. What was Ethan's best friend doing here already? Inside, I found Edith sitting in her favorite armchair, looking small and lost. Vanessa hovered nearby, one manicured hand on Edith's shoulder in what seemed more like possession than comfort. My brother stood by the fireplace, deep in conversation with Mark. "Oh, Riley, dear." Edith's voice wavered as she reached for me. I crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her trembling hands in mine. They were ice cold. "I'm here," I whispered, ignoring Vanessa's slight step backward, as if making room for me was physically painful for her. "We were just discussing arrangements," Vanessa said, her tone carrying that familiar edge of authority. "The funeral home needs decisions by morning, and there's the matter of the estate to consider." I felt Edith's hands tighten around mine. "The estate?" I asked, not bothering to hide my disbelief. "Harold's been gone for what, 2 hours?" "These things need to be handled promptly," Vanessa replied, shooting me a look that clearly said, "Stay in your lane." "Especially with properties of this value." Ethan cleared his throat. "Maybe we should focus on the immediate needs first," he suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. I'd heard that tone before, the sound of my brother choosing the path of least resistance. "I just want to sit with my memories for a while," Edith said quietly, her voice stronger than I expected. "Harold always said there's no rush in doing things right." Something flickered across Vanessa's face, frustration? Concern? Before her practiced smile returned. "Of course, Edith. We're all here to support you. Whatever you need." But as I watched my sister-in-law's perfectly manicured fingers drum against her designer handbag, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Harold's death had created a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. Especially when there's a 3-story Victorian house with original woodwork at stake. Mark caught my eye from across the room and gave me a subtle head shake. He knew something that made him show up at this ungodly hour. And judging by the way he kept glancing between Vanessa and Edith, whatever he knew wasn't good. I squeezed Edith's hands gently, making a silent promise. Whatever game was starting here tonight, I wouldn't let her face it alone. 3 days after Harold's death, we gathered at Ethan and Vanessa's downtown penthouse for what was supposed to be a family dinner. The city lights twinkled through floor-to-ceiling windows, but the view did nothing to warm the Arctic chill in the room. "I just think it's admirable how you manage on a teacher's salary," Vanessa said, delicately cutting into her salmon. "Though I worry about your retirement planning, Riley. Have you considered a career change?" I gripped my fork tighter, catching Mark's sympathetic glance from across the table. He'd been invited as a buffer, but even his usually reliable charm couldn't deflect Vanessa's passive-aggressive missiles tonight. "I love teaching," I replied, keeping my voice level. And my students love Harold's woodworking lessons. Loved, I corrected myself, the past tense still feeling wrong on my tongue. Vanessa's perfectly shaped eyebrows arched. Oh, you were still doing those? How? Quaint. Speaking of Harold, Ethan and I were discussing Edith's situation earlier. Her situation? I set down my fork, appetite vanishing. Well, that house is far too big for her now, Vanessa continued, shooting a look at my brother. And the maintenance alone. We think it would be best if she considered downsizing. There's a lovely assisted living facility. She's not going to assisted living, I cut in. She's completely independent and that house is her home. Actually, Ethan cleared his throat. Vanessa's been researching some options. They're really more like luxury apartments. With full-time care staff, Vanessa added quickly. Really, it's the responsible choice. We can't have her rattling around that old house alone. What if she fell? Mark leaned forward. Funny you should mention the house. I was looking at the property records for the Historical Society and… More wine. Vanessa interrupted, standing abruptly. She circled the table with the bottle, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floors like warning shots. I watched her refill glasses with practiced precision, noting how her hand trembled slightly when she reached Mark. He knew something, and she knew he knew. The funeral's tomorrow, Ethan said, clearly trying to change the subject. Vanessa's been amazing, handling all the arrangements. Without consulting Edith, I pointed out. She wanted a small service at the house, not some production at St. Michael's. St. Michael's is more appropriate, Vanessa snapped, mask slipping for a moment. The whole community wants to pay their respects. We can't have people traipsing through that old house. The liability alone. The liability? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Harold's not even in the ground yet, and you're worried about liability? Riley, Ethan warned, but I was done playing nice. No, let's be honest for once. This isn't about Edith's welfare. This is about the prime real estate her Victorian sits on, isn't it? Right in the path of your firm's development project. The silence that followed was deafening. Vanessa's face went white, then red. Ethan looked between us like he was watching a tennis match and Mark. Mark was suddenly very interested in his wine glass. I don't know what you think you're implying, Vanessa said, her voice deadly quiet, but I'm only trying to help. Unlike some people, I actually understand the financial realities of maintaining a property like that. But then, money management was never your strong suit, was it? Vanessa, Ethan started, but she steamrolled over him. No, it needs to be said. You live in that tiny apartment, playing house with the neighbor lady, pretending you're some small-town hero. Meanwhile, your brother and I are trying to build something real, something lasting. But you wouldn't understand that, would you? I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. You're right, I don't understand. I don't understand how you can look at someone's grief and see a business opportunity. I don't understand how my brother can sit there and let you. That's enough. Ethan slammed his hand on the table, making the crystal wine glasses jump. Both of you, just. Enough. But as I looked at my brother's face, I saw something I'd never noticed before: fear. Not of the conflict, but of choosing sides. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about Edith's house anymore. This was about every time Ethan had looked the other way, every time he'd chosen peace over principle. You're right, I said quietly, dropping my napkin on the table. It is enough. I left them sitting there, the city lights casting long shadows across their expensive floors, their expensive lives. But as I waited for the elevator, I heard footsteps behind me. Riley, wait, Mark called out. There's something you need to know about Harold's will. Mark's revelation about Harold's will haunted me through the funeral service at St. Michael's. I barely heard the priest's words, too focused on what I'd learned. Harold had left Edith more than just the house. He'd left her controlling interest in several downtown properties, including the block Vanessa's firm wanted to develop. I sat in the back pew, watching Vanessa play the role of grieving family friend perfectly. Her black designer dress and tasteful pearls a stark contrast to Edith's simple navy suit. But now I knew why she'd been hovering so close these past few days. After the service, I followed the sound of voices to the church's small garden. What I overheard made my blood run cold. The medication is making her confused, Vanessa was saying to someone on her phone, partially hidden behind a marble angel. Yes, I understand the timeline is tight, but I can handle Edith. She trusts me now. No, Riley won't be an issue. She's too naive to understand what's really at stake. My hands clenched into fists, crumpling the funeral program I was holding. The rustling paper must have caught Vanessa's attention because she spun around, nearly dropping her phone. I'll call you back, she said quickly, then painted on a concerned smile. Riley, dear, shouldn't you be helping Edith with the reception arrangements? Cut the act, Vanessa. What medication are you talking about? She waved her hand dismissively. Just some mild anti-anxiety pills the doctor prescribed. Edith's been having trouble sleeping since Harold passed. I'm helping her manage the dosage. Like you're helping her manage her properties? Something dangerous flashed in Vanessa's eyes. You know, Riley, this holier-than-thou routine is getting old. Not everything is a conspiracy. Some of us actually understand business and finance. And some of us understand elder abuse when we see it. Vanessa stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Be very careful what you're implying. Ethan and I are trying to build a future here. A real future, not whatever small-town fantasy you're living. Don't make me choose between family loyalty and business necessity. Is that a threat? It's reality. You think you're protecting Edith? You're just prolonging the inevitable. That neighborhood is changing with or without her cooperation. The smart play is to help her transition now, while she can still benefit from the deal. Before I could respond, Mark appeared around the corner. Everything okay here? Perfect, Vanessa said smoothly. Just discussing the reception details. Speaking of which. She glided away, leaving behind only the scent of expensive perfume and unspoken warnings. Mark waited until she was out of earshot. You okay? She's medicating Edith, I said through gritted teeth. Probably trying to make her seem incompetent before pushing through the property sale. That tracks with what I found, Mark nodded. The development plans were filed months ago. They're already selling pre-construction units in a building that's supposed to go where Edith's house stands. My stomach lurched. How is that even legal? It's not. But proving it. He shrugged. Corporate law is Vanessa's specialty. She knows how to cover her tracks. I watched through the garden archway as Vanessa rejoined the funeral guests, placing a solicitous hand on Edith's arm. My surrogate grandmother looked smaller somehow, less certain. Was that the medication's effect? I need proof, I said finally. Real proof, not just suspicions. Mark hesitated. I might know someone who could help. But Riley, are you sure you want to go down this road? This isn't just about Edith's house anymore. If what I suspect is true, we're talking about major real estate fraud. Going up against Vanessa means going up against your brother too. I thought about Ethan, about all the times he'd chosen the path of least resistance. About Harold's workshop, where he'd taught me that doing the right thing wasn't always the easy thing. Sometimes, I said, watching Vanessa guide Edith toward her car, family isn't about who you're born to. It's about who you choose to protect. Mark nodded slowly. Okay then. But whatever we find, there's no going back. I know, I said, and I did. Because I'd just seen Vanessa slip something into her purse, something that looked suspiciously like a prescription bottle with Edith's name on it. The time for playing nice was over. The morning after the funeral, I found Edith sitting in Harold's workshop, turning one of his unfinished music boxes over in her trembling hands. Something about her posture made me pause in the doorway. She looked defeated, smaller somehow. I can't seem to find my anxiety medication, she said without looking up. Vanessa usually brings it, but... She trailed off, her fingers tracing the half-carved patterns on the wooden lid. How long has Vanessa been managing your medication? I kept my voice casual, though my heart was racing. Oh, she's been so helpful since Harold. Edith's voice cracked. I've been having such trouble sleeping, and she said these pills would help. But sometimes I feel... strange. Confused. Yesterday, I signed some papers, but I can't quite remember. My stomach dropped. What papers, Edith? Something about the property taxes, I think. Or was it insurance? She pressed her fingers to her temples. Everything's so fuzzy lately. I pulled up a stool beside her, noting how her usually sharp eyes seemed clouded. Would you let me take you to see Dr. Chin? Just for a checkup? Before she could answer, the workshop door creaked. Ethan stood there, looking uncomfortable in his tailored suit among Harold's tools and sawdust. Everything okay in here? He glanced between us. Vanessa sent me to check on Edith. She's worried about her missing her medication schedule. I bet she is, I muttered. Edith suddenly gripped my hand. Riley, dear, could you fetch my reading glasses from upstairs? I'd like to show Ethan some of Harold's sketches. Something in her tone made me hesitate, but I nodded and headed for the stairs. At the bottom, I paused, hidden from view. Ethan, Edith's voice was clearer now, stronger. Harold always said you reminded him of himself at your age. So full of potential, but too afraid to stand up to the people you love. Edith, He also said the true measure of a man isn't in what he builds, but in what he protects. A pause. Your wife is drugging me, dear. The silence that followed was deafening. I held my breath, waiting for my brother's response. That's not possible. Vanessa would never. The same way she would never use your friendship with Mark to get information about Harold's properties, Edith's voice was gentle. But the words landed like slaps. The same way she would never forge my signature on development permits? How did you? I may be old, Ethan, but I'm not stupid. Not yet, anyway. Though these pills of hers are certainly trying their best. The sound of wood scraping against wood, Edith setting down the music box. The question is, what are you going to do about it? I heard my brother's sharp intake of breath, followed by footsteps pacing the workshop floor. If what you're saying is true, God, this could ruin everything. The firm, our reputation. Your sister's trust, Edith added quietly. Though I suspect you've already lost that. More silence, then the sound of the workshop door opening. I need to think, Ethan said, his voice thick. Just don't tell Riley about this conversation. Please. I slipped into the shadows as my brother hurried past, his face twisted with conflict. When I returned to the workshop, Edith was exactly where I'd left her, but something had changed. She looked more alert, more like her old self. I didn't really need those reading glasses, did I? I asked. Edith smiled sadly. No, dear. But you needed to hear that conversation as much as your brother needed to have it. She picked up the unfinished music box again. Harold always said timing was everything, whether you're crafting wood or crafting justice. I stared at her, understanding dawning. You're not confused at all, are you? Let's just say I've been paying very close attention to what everyone's been doing in my house since Harold died. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a small recorder. And I think it's time we had a conversation about exactly what was in those papers I signed yesterday. The music box sat between us, its unfinished edges catching the morning light, a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful things come from the roughest beginnings. Mark's law office felt too small for the weight of what we were discussing. Edith sat straight-backed in a leather chair, the recorder placed carefully on the desk between us, while I paced behind her. These signatures, Mark said, spreading out the documents Edith had brought, they're good forgeries. Without the recording, it would be your word against theirs. Play it again, I insisted, even though we'd already listened 3 times. Vanessa's voice filled the room. Just sign here, Edith dear. It's all standard paperwork for the property tax reassessment. Then the sound of shuffling papers. And Edith's deliberately slurred voice asking questions that Vanessa smoothly deflected. Power of attorney, Mark explained, tapping the documents. Plus preliminary sales agreements for all the downtown properties, including the house. They're dated before Harold's death. Edith's hands remained steady in her lap. Harold always said Vanessa reminded him of a chess player, always thinking 3 moves ahead. But why forge documents dated before Harold's death? I stopped pacing. Unless they needed to establish a pattern, Mark finished. Show that Harold had already agreed to sell before he died. Makes everything look more legitimate. A knock at the door made us all jump. Mark's assistant stuck her head in. Mr. Monroe is here. He's quite insistent. My brother burst in before anyone could respond. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his tie loose. Riley, what the hell? Vanessa just got served with a cease and desist order. Good, I said. That means our lawyer did his job. Ethan's eyes landed on the recorder, then the documents. His face went pale. What are you doing? Protecting Edith. Something you should have done weeks ago. You don't understand what's at stake here, he said, running his hands through his hair. The development project, the investors. This isn't just about Vanessa anymore. If this gets out, people could lose everything. People already are losing everything, I shot back. Or don't the elderly count when there's money on the table? That's not fair. No. I grabbed one of the forged documents. Is this fair? Drugging someone to steal their property? Using their grief as a weapon? Riley, Edith's quiet voice cut through my anger. Show him the other envelope. My hands shook as I pulled out Harold's last letter to Edith. I'd found it hidden in the music box that morning, dated just days before his death. I handed it to my brother. Ethan read silently, his face crumpling. He knew, he whispered. Harold knew what we were planning. He knew, Edith confirmed. And he knew what Vanessa was capable of. That's why he changed his will the day before he died. Changed his. Ethan sank into a chair. What did he do? Mark pulled out another document. He left everything to a trust. The only way the properties can be sold is if all 3 trustees agree. He paused. The trustees are Edith, Riley, and you, Ethan. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. I watched my brother's face as the implication sank in. Harold had given him a choice: protect his family's legacy or protect his wife's schemes. Vanessa doesn't know about the trust yet, I said quietly. But she will when we file these recordings with the police. The police? Ethan's head snapped up. Riley, you can't. This would destroy her career. Our marriage. Then stop us, I challenged. Tell me why we shouldn't. Ethan looked at Edith, still sitting calmly in her chair. I'm sorry, he whispered. I knew something wasn't right, but I didn't want to see it. I thought I could protect everyone by staying quiet. Sometimes, Edith said, reaching for his hand, the kindest thing we can do is force the truth into the light. My phone buzzed, a text from Vanessa. We need to talk. Now. Alone. I showed it to Mark, who shook his head. Don't go. Let the lawyers handle this. But as I looked at my brother's broken expression, at Edith's quiet strength, I knew what I had to do. Sometimes you have to face the dragon in its own den. I'll meet her, I said, already heading for the door. But first, I'm making copies of everything. Behind me, I heard Ethan's sharp intake of breath. Riley, wait. There's something else you need to know about Harold's death. The truth about Harold's death hit me like a physical blow. I sat in my car outside Vanessa's office building, Ethan's words echoing in my head. Vanessa was there that night. She went to confront Harold about the properties, and things got heated. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The police had ruled Harold's heart attack natural causes, but knowing Vanessa had been there had stressed him into it. The security guard waved me through to the executive parking level. Vanessa's Tesla sat alone in her reserved spot, gleaming under fluorescent lights. Everything about her life was perfectly polished, carefully controlled. Until now. I found her in her corner office, silhouetted against the city's skyline. She didn't turn around when I entered. You know, she said, swirling amber liquid in a crystal glass, I actually admired you when we first met. So principled. So sure of yourself. She laughed softly. God, how naive you were. Did you go to Harold's workshop to threaten him? She turned then, her perfect makeup unable to hide the darkness under her eyes. I went to reason with him, to explain what we could accomplish together. But he wouldn't listen. So you killed him. I didn't touch him. The crystal glass shattered against her desk. He had a heart attack. I called for help. I tried. She stopped, composing herself. But you're not here about Harold, are you? You're here about the recordings. And the forged documents. The drugging. All of it. Vanessa smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. You have no idea what it's like, do you? Growing up with nothing, fighting for everything, finally building something real. Then watching it all slip away because some old man decided to play games with his will. Harold was protecting his family. Family? She spat the word. Where was his precious family when he was alive? Where were you when Edith needed help with the house? When the repairs piled up? Ethan and I were there. We earned this. By drugging an elderly woman? By forging documents? By doing what needed to be done. She moved around the desk, each step deliberate. And now you're going to do what needs to be done. What's that supposed to mean? She pulled out her phone, tapped the screen, and turned it toward me. My heart stopped. On the screen was a video of Ethan, clearly drunk, handling documents in Harold's workshop the night of his death. Your brother was there too, Vanessa said softly. He didn't know what would happen, of course. But he helped create those documents you're so righteous about. One call to the police, and he goes down with me. The room seemed to tilt. You'd destroy your own husband? To protect what we've built? In a heartbeat. She set the phone down. But it doesn't have to come to that. The trust needs all 3 trustees to agree to a sale, right? So agree. My voice felt distant, hollow. Or you'll send Ethan to prison. Life is full of impossible choices, Riley. Welcome to the real world. I stared at the broken glass on her desk, thinking of Harold's unfinished music box, of Edith's quiet strength, of my brother's tortured confession. Everything I'd fought for seemed to crumble around me. You have until tomorrow morning, Vanessa said, turning back to her window. Oh, and Riley? Don't bother going to Edith for help. Check your phone. A text from Mark was waiting. Edith's in the hospital. Possible stroke. Get here now. My legs nearly gave out. What did you do? Me? Nothing. Stress affects elderly people in unpredictable ways, especially when they stop taking their medication. Her reflection smiled in the darkened glass. Tick-tock, Riley. What's it going to be? Your principals or your family? I backed toward the door, my mind racing. Everything we'd gathered, the recordings, the documents, Harold's letter, none of it mattered if Ethan went to prison and Edith. I couldn't even finish the thought. One more thing, Vanessa called as I reached the door. Harold's last words? He asked me to tell Ethan he was sorry. Funny, isn't it? In the end, he was apologizing to us. I fled her office, but I couldn't outrun the truth. In trying to protect everyone, I might have destroyed them all. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Mark. There's something in Harold's workshop you need to see. Now. Harold's workshop smelled of sawdust and secrets. Mark stood at the workbench, holding what looked like an old security camera. Harold installed it after the first break-in attempt, he explained, connecting it to his laptop. Hidden in the rafters, motion activated. I found it when I was helping Edith catalog his tools. The footage was grainy but clear enough. I watched as Vanessa entered the workshop that night, followed by Harold. Their argument was muted but intense. Then Ethan stumbled in, clearly drunk, waving papers. But what made my breath catch was what happened next, a 4th person entering the frame. Is that? Edith, Mark confirmed. She saw everything. My phone buzzed. A text from Vanessa. Decision time. Meeting at the house in 20 minutes. Bring the trust paperwork. I looked at Mark. Call the hospital. Get Edith ready to move. The Victorian house loomed dark against the evening sky. Inside, Vanessa paced the living room while Ethan sat slumped in Harold's old armchair, looking defeated. The papers? Vanessa demanded. First, tell me what really happened that night. She laughed sharply. You still don't get it, do you? It doesn't matter what happened. What matters is what happens next. It matters to me. Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. Tell her, Vanessa. Tell her what you did to my father. The room went still. What did you say? Harold wasn't just my mentor, Ethan continued, finally looking up. He was my biological father. That's why he changed his will at the end. That's why he was trying to protect me from you. Vanessa's perfect composure cracked. You knew? All this time. I found out the night he died. That's why I was there, drunk, angry. But you. He stood up. You knew for months, didn't you? Used it to pressure him into signing those first documents. I did it for us. Vanessa's voice rose hysterically. Everything I did was to secure our future. The properties, the development deals. The medications? I cut in. The forged papers? Harold's death? He was going to ruin everything. She grabbed her phone. One call, and your precious brother goes to prison. Is that what you want? Go ahead, I said quietly. Make the call. She froze, something in my tone making her hesitate. Or we could watch the security footage from the workshop first. All of it, including the part where you switched Harold's heart medication before the argument. The phone slipped from her fingers. That's impossible. I checked. The camera in the rafters? That was just the backup. I nodded toward the doorway. Harold had another one in his old music box. The one sitting on his workbench that night. The one Edith took with her when she left. As if on cue, the front door opened. Edith walked in, steady on her feet, followed by 2 police officers. She held Harold's unfinished music box in her hands. No stroke, I'm afraid, she said to Vanessa. Though I do appreciate your concern for my health. The hospital stay gave us time to get everything in order. Vanessa lunged for the door, but Mark stepped in to block her path. It's over, he said gently. She crumpled to the floor, all her careful control shattering. I just wanted to belong, she sobbed. To prove I was worth something. You all had this perfect family, these deep roots, and I had nothing, Edith finished, approaching her. Just like I did when I first married Harold. He taught me that family isn't about blood or property or proving yourself. It's about the choices we make every day to protect or destroy what matters. I watched as the police led Vanessa away, her mascara tracking black tears down her cheeks. Ethan stood by the window, his shoulders shaking silently. What happens now? He asked nobody in particular. Edith opened the music box, revealing Harold's last project, 3 identical keys nestled in velvet. Now, she said, we honor your father's last wish. Together. She handed us each a key, and in that moment, I understood what Harold had known all along. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destruction, but reconstruction. Building something new from the ashes of what was lost. The music box played its unfinished melody as we stood there, 3 generations bound not by blood or property, but by choice. 1 year later, I stood in Harold's workshop, now transformed into a community woodworking classroom. The autumn light filtered through dusty windows, catching the fresh sawdust in the air as my students worked on their projects. Edith moved between the workbenches, her experienced hands guiding young fingers on tools that had once been Harold's. The Victorian house had found new purpose as a community center, its rooms filled with art classes, after-school programs, and senior activities. Miss Monroe. Tommy, one of my 6th graders, held up a half-finished music box. Is this right? I smiled, recognizing Harold's design. Perfect. He would have loved seeing this. The door creaked open, and Ethan stepped in, looking more at ease in jeans and a work shirt than I'd ever seen him in his suits. He'd left the development firm months ago, starting his own restoration company focused on preserving historic buildings. Ready for visitors? He asked, gesturing outside. I nodded, and he opened the door wider. 2 guards escorted Vanessa in, her prison uniform a stark contrast to her former polished appearance. But her eyes were clearer now, more present. The garden looks beautiful, she said softly, taking in the view through the workshop windows. The community plots were a good idea. It was Edith's suggestion, I replied. Like everything else here. Vanessa watched the children working, her fingers twitching slightly as if remembering her own first attempts at creation rather than destruction. I got your letter, she said. About the rehabilitation program. Teaching business skills to former inmates. We have space, Edith interrupted, approaching us. And experience with new beginnings. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken words. Then Vanessa reached into her pocket and pulled out a familiar object, the key she'd taken the night of her arrest. I think this belongs here, she said, placing it on the workbench. I'm sorry it took so long to return it. Edith picked up the key, studying it in the sunlight. Harold always said timing was everything. In woodworking and in life. Speaking of timing, Ethan cleared his throat, Mark's waiting at the courthouse with the paperwork. If you're all still sure about this. We were. The decision to make Vanessa part of the rehabilitation program hadn't been easy, but as Harold's last letter had reminded us, Sometimes the hardest wood makes the strongest bridges. As the guards prepared to leave with Vanessa, she turned back. Why? After everything I did. Because revenge destroys two houses, Edith said simply. Harold taught us that. But redemption can build whole communities. Later, after the students had gone and the workshop grew quiet, I found a small package on Harold's old workbench. Inside was a letter in Edith's handwriting and a single wooden puzzle piece. Dear Riley, it read. Harold left one last project unfinished, a puzzle box he meant for all of us. Each piece holds part of his story, his wisdom. I've given others to Ethan, to Mark, and yes, even to Vanessa. Only together can you understand the full picture. He believed that broken things, when mended with care and purpose, become stronger at the fractures. Your piece reads, the truest revenge is to teach your enemy to build rather than destroy. I held the puzzle piece up to the light, seeing the intricate pattern Harold had carved into it. Somewhere out there, Vanessa held another piece, Ethan another, each of us carrying a fragment of the larger truth. The workshop smelled of fresh sawdust and possibility. Outside, I could hear new voices in the garden, children learning to grow things, seniors sharing stories. A community healing its fractures one small piece at a time. I placed the puzzle piece carefully in the unfinished music box on my desk, the one Harold had started and I was slowly learning to complete. Its melody was still imperfect, but like all works in progress, it carried the promise of something beautiful in its incompletion. Sometimes the best endings aren't endings at all, but doorways to something new. Harold knew that. And now, finally, so did I.